Welcome everyone to Bread and Roses. I'm Maryam Namazie, and with my colleague Fariborz Pooya, today we're discussing in this weekly program the so-called election, or better said, selection of Ebrahim Raisi to the presidency of the Islamic Republic of Iran. We want to talk about him, about what sort of person he is, or more accurately, what sort of criminal he is. And but before we do, I think it's good to just go over quickly uh, the fact that the so-called elections in Iran are not really elections. They are selections of Ali Khamenei, who's the supreme spiritual leader. And in the same way that Ebrahim Raisi was selected as head of judiciary of Iran in 2019, so he has been selected as the president. It's not a landslide victory, as some in the media have mentioned. It has been the lowest turnout in the past 40 years of the so-called elections of this presidency of the Islamic Republic. And of course, in the past, some would feel that they needed to choose between bad and worse, choose the bad, which were the so-called reformists. And now it's reached a point where it's become very clear to a vast majority of people that whether they are reformists, so-called reformists, or whether they are conservatives, it is the same catastrophe for people in Iran. And I think that showed very clearly in this selection of Ebrahim Raisi as president.
Yeah, all of the so-called reformist group, they all rallied around Khamenei's call to participate. A majority of people said very a definite no, and they said they would not participate in the sham election. And all of those reformists sort of went to the other side. They put away any pretense that they had. Recently, a couple of days ago, the supposedly current reformist president Rouhani said, "We're all the same. It doesn't matter who is which president, which year. We all belong to the Islamic regime, and they are truly representative of a horrible system that has no value, does not put any value on human life."
Yeah, and I think there has been some social media comment about how this election was a fraud because the liberal candidates were denied access to run, they were barred, and that itself is a joke because there are no liberal candidates. The only ones who are allowed to run, whether they are so-called reformists or conservatives, are those who have shown their allegiance to the regime. They are people who have proven themselves loyal, and especially so by committing human rights violations. And that's why when you look at Raisi, you can see he is the ideal president. He is this butcher of people in Iran, and he is the president of the execution capital of the world. So he fits perfectly, nakedly, without any masks. They are showing the type of government that they are, the type of regime that they are. So, I mean, if we go now and speak about Raisi in particular, I think, and talk about his background and the crimes that he has committed, and why, for example, the Secretary General of Amnesty International has said that rather than him being elected in a position of the presidency, he should be investigated for his crimes against humanity.
Let's listen to this, Maryam, for a second. It would be great. Hold on.
زدا باشد انشاءالله در حوزه مبارزه با فساد ما نه انگشت مفسدان از بازو دست اونها رو قطع خواهیم کرد.
So that's a summary. I think it would be helpful to speak about history of this man, because I don't think, although he's well documented in Amnesty, they've got, I think, 150-page report on him and his crime. I don't think general public may not know much about this man. He, when he was, I think, 17, 18, he took part in the 1979 revolutionary, part of the Islamist group, and when he was 19, he was appointed the prosecutor general in major cities in Karaj and Hamadan, and he was responsible for rounding up and summary execution of a lot of political opponents of the Islamists. So at the beginning of the massacre of the people who are in opposition in Iran. And then he became, later on, there is a character in history of Iran, Iranian torture, and Evin prison. It's called Lajwadi. Lajwadi was appointed by Raisi, this man, and he was reporting, and he was a savage. And later on, when Ebrahim Raisi, the current president, became the prosecutor general in Tehran region, he came to the attention of Khomeini as somebody who is so ruthless and brutal that later on appointed him as the four-man death committee, who was responsible for summary execution of a lot of opponents of the regime who were in prison. These people who've been arrested, sentenced, and some of those people have actually finished their prison sentence and about to be released. The death committee enters prison and executes a lot of those people with very short interview sessions. Maryam could tell you about that a lot.
So in the summer of '88 in particular, this what happened is in a very short period, thousands of political prisoners were executed. As Fariborz said, some of them had finished their sentences and were to be freed. And in summary trials, asking very simple questions like, do you pray? If they said no, it was off to execution. Do you believe in God? No, it was off to execution. And in this way, they executed so many people. Some say the figure is 3,000, 5,000. Some even say the figure goes in the tens of thousands. It's impossible to know because a lot of it was done in secret. And a lot of the people who were killed were buried in mass graves, like a place like Khavaran, the place of the damned, they called it. And it's a place where they buried many of the best of Iranian society that were executed during that summer. And also, we know that families were told to, for those who were executed by firing squad, they were told to come, and if they were given their bodies, they were told to pay for the bullet. And you've got people alive today still, because this is, a very recent history, who have personal grievances against Raisi because he was in the room when they were tortured, and and they have loved ones who they have lost because he ordered their execution.
So we're dealing here with a man who is responsible for execution and of many people. And imagine that type of character has been put in charge of the judiciary system in different regions, and he's continued to commit those crimes. In the last 3 years, he's been the head of judiciary in Iran. Remember, a couple of years ago, there were mass protests in Iran, and 1,500 people were killed on the streets under his watch. Nobody was brought to book. We have been campaigning for release of political prisoners, or people who've been executed most recently. that's been under his guidance, because judiciary and the prison systems work hand in hand, and he is the brutal murderer and the most horrible character in the Islamic regime. And the question is that why at this time Khamenei and the Islamic regime decided to appoint him as a president.
If we can just also expand on that before you go into the why, I think one of the key things to understand for people who are watching this is that the judiciary is not an elected position. You know, the head of judiciary, it is again selected by Khamenei, and the as a top prosecutor and judiciary official over decades, you know, he has been directly responsible for a lot of the crimes that have taken place, because the judiciary is also in charge of the intelligence service, the security apparatus, the prisons and detention centers and what happens in them. And so he has been a key figure in what has happened over the past decades, the crimes against humanity that have taken place. And so, you know, when they talk about officials in Iran having their hands drenched in blood, really, he is drenched from, you know, the top of his turban to the bottom of his feet. He is drowning in the blood of people, really. And he is someone who has to be prosecuted for his crimes rather than acting as head of state.
Yeah, and I think the question is, why have the Islamic regime system appointed this man? Because for many years they pretended that there's a reformist group who's going to come in and put them at the point of in charge of executive sort of power of Islamic regime, and that was a means by which the European government and United States continued to deal with the Islamic regime and support them and negotiate with them. Now, the question of why have they actually appointed this horrible man who is the extreme right of the of the spectrum within Islamists in power in Iran? And the reason is because they have no other choice, because they are telling the people in Iran directly. That's the first point. Directly telling the people of Iran that we are going to appoint the butcher of Iran as your president. Protest and expect severe punishment if you continue to protest. What we've seen recently, the galvanized opposition against the Islamic regime with the significant no to the Islamic regime through the election, the boycott of the election, and active refusal to participate in the sham election. We've just seen a huge national strike starting in oil and petrochemical industry in Iran. So there is a struggle going on, a battle going on between people of Iran and the Islamic regime. And guess what? Islamists have no option but to bring the butchers out and say, this is how we're going to deal with this. And also, I think that points to the fact that the Islamic regime feels they have no option but to, because they have to support the ranks in terms of keep the moral of the ranks, to be able to say, look, there is a future here, and we deal with protests and opposition severely. And that's, I think that's the key message. But at the same time, it points to the weakness of the Islamic regime, because they have no other option but to do this, because this opposition in Iran is getting stronger by day. It's a lot more coordinated, and we've seen that in the recent mass walkout across various sites of the oil and petrochemical industry. And that's what we'll be discussing next week in Bread and Roses, the significance of that and detail of how the Islamic regime has treated the working people in Iran.
Yeah, and also you can see very clearly with the fact that this had the lowest turnout, the so-called elections, which is more of a farce, lowest turnout in the 40 years history of the regime, even though in the media they're calling it a landslide victory. I mean, the reality is that it was, according to their own confessions, the lowest turnout. It's very clear that people were out in the streets very bravely saying that their vote is for the overthrow of the regime. And what happened is the whole reformist, so-called reformist project, which was to act as a safety valve to remove pressure against the regime, has failed miserably, because people saw very clearly, those who might have felt that they should vote for the bad option versus the worst option, they saw very clearly that the so-called reformers from Khatami to Rouhani were no different really when it came to improving the lives of people in Iran. Some of the worst rights violations have taken place under the so-called reformers. And so they realize the safety valve doesn't work now, and they're trying to put fear in people's hearts. But I mean, if you look at those public testimonies of people who've said they won't vote and why they won't vote, the fact that people are out on the streets saying it so clearly shows that that just isn't going to work anymore. And what has happened now is that we're seeing the regime in its full so-called glory, which is really, you know, a vehicle of suppression. And going back to this issue of Raisi being on the death commission, I mean, this is something not that only the opposition is saying, or human rights organizations like Amnesty International are saying, but even someone like Ayatollah Montazeri, who was supposed to become the successor of Ayatollah Khomeini initially, he was recorded. There's a recording of him that was distributed where he said to Raisi and the Death Commission that they have committed the biggest crimes in the Islamic Republic of Iran. And that's a big thing to say, because there's so much crimes that they've committed, and that they will be known as criminals. And of course, you know, this is something that they themselves, those within the regime, know very well as well. And that's why Khamenei, you know, congratulates him, because he's done a great service to the regime in fulfilling its human rights violations and trying to suppress people who just seem to be unsuppressible.
Yeah, and I think that the question arises: what is the world going to do with Islamic regime and its representative, who is a proven criminal, and who is wanted for crime against humanity? One thing is very clear: there are human rights organizations, and a lot of people are preparing case against him. We have no doubt that if he steps out of Iran, although some people have started to argue that he has immunity as president, that won't be the case. He steps out of Iran, he'll be arrested, or there would be an attempt to arrest him, and that's I think that's important to recognize. At the same time, unfortunately, we will continue to see that the United States, European unions will continue to work with the Islamic regime. They are very clear that irrespective of who's in power, irrespective of the record of the president of the Islamic regime, they will continue to work with the Islamic regime, because part of the current negotiations on so-called nuclear issue, it's about reducing the ability of the Islamic regime to operate in Middle East, and I think that's what they want to do. It has no relation to human rights violation in Iran. They would not consider that at all. It's never been, and it never will be part of the. It would have no impact on the United States or European governments. Yesterday or a couple of days ago, the foreign minister of Germany and United States met in Vienna, I think, and they were very clear that now there are the statement they're using is that a person in power in Iran, it's Khamenei. It doesn't matter who the president is. So really, they want to ignore the issue of Raisi and continue to work with the Islamic regime and continue to negotiate with them, and that's what they want to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that clearly it's I think Siamak Younesi made a recommendation that we have to petition to ban him from traveling to the UK and EU. I think that's a really important point. I do think that there is huge amounts of evidence against this person, and he really should not be free to travel. And we should embarrass the regime and its officials. Of course, it's something that they've done for the past 40 years, but we have to keep putting pressure so that it makes it very difficult for them to operate outside of the country. And in Iran, of course, protests continue. We have to make sure that we're supporting those people in Iran who are so bravely and at such great risk standing up against the government. It's interesting because when at a press conference they asked Raisi about his role in the Death Commission, he said something vague about how he has always defended human rights. And I suppose from his perspective, this is Islamic human rights. The right to kill, the right to torture, the right to flog, the right to amputate. I mean, this is what they have done for so many decades, and I think it is shameful for those who voted outside of the country for Raisi at various embassies, even though the numbers were very low. And of course, even government supporters were saying that the opposition had surrounded the embassies, making it difficult for people to vote. No one really wanted to vote anyway, but even the small amounts that did, it's so shameful. Fariborz, you were at the protest in London. So I think that's, that sort of support and solidarity needs to continue. And we have to be sure that, people in Iran get the sort of a secular, a modern government that they deserve. And this, this is not going to happen under a theocracy. Theocracies don't belong in the 21st century. And that's something that we have to keep insisting on and supporting people in Iran so that we can be rid of this regime once and for all, because honestly, it's been 40 years and it's been 40 years too long.
Yeah, and I think what I noticed at the protest in London last week in front of the Iranian consulate, where the election ballot supposedly was managed. Previous years, we've seen a lot of people queuing up to vote. This year, hardly any. I was there for about 4 hours. I don't think I saw about 10. And people who were there reported about 30 people who came in. And there were agents and employees of the government who went in to vote. And there were 4 or 5 other sites. Even the head of the Islamic societies in the UK, where they were discussing with other journalists the state of the election on the day, he complained that the turnout was extremely low. That was in UK, Islamic societies in UK. Mm-hmm. It's very clearly, reports are in Tehran, for example, only 17% of people took part in the election. So this man doesn't represent people of Iran, has no legitimacy, and he's a mass murderer. This is a simple fact. And the other factor is that low turnout is indication that there is so much opposition to this government, and we could see that the people are preparing to bring an end to the Islamic regime. As I mentioned earlier, 3 days ago, mass nationwide strikes started in sections of oil and petrochemical industry, and it's going to continue to next week, and then they'll make a decision. And this is the first time that in the last 40 years we've seen coordinated action within the labor movement, and I think it's important to focus on that next week. But this is an indication. That's why the Islamic regime knows that it's is surrounded, is isolated in Iran, and then that's why they need to bring the brute force, that's Raisi, to power, because to indicate that they are not prepared to retreat and give in to demands of people of Iran. And unfortunately, we will see that the European Unions, United States and other countries, China and Russia, as you know, they will continue to support the Islamic regime against the people of Iran. But what we have to do, we have to expose not only Raisi, but also those people who are negotiating with them. And I think it's important to rely on international solidarity, progressive forces, trade unions, human rights organizations. There are a huge amount of people internationally who would support people of Iran, because to overthrow the Islamic regime, you not only support a secular government and a decent government in Iran, but you'll get rid of terrorism in Middle East and threat of terrorism in Europe. A simple fact that Islamic regime is the biggest funder of terrorism in Middle East, North Africa, and supports a lot of terrorist organization in Europe and America all the time. So I think it's important that people to realize, to bring an end to all of that, the Islamic regime must go and will go.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I also think that it's important to add that there are segments of progressive people who feel that, because of their anti-US imperialism and militarism, that they need to defend regimes like Assad's regime or the Islamic Republic of Iran. And again, the reality of the matter is that you don't have to choose between the two of them. You can oppose both US militarism and also Islamism, which is an imperialist force as well in the Middle East and North Africa, and that has really slaughtered entire generations of progressive working class people in that region, in that country. And so it's hugely important that people support people. We don't rely on governments. They have their own interests, economic, political interests that have very little to do with human rights, as you mentioned, Fariborz. But we really, you've got a huge protest, modern, secular protest movement in Iran that needs to be supported and needs to be supported unequivocally. And I think with the fact that we've got social media, this is something we've mentioned before, we are able to make connections that were very difficult before. There is really no excuse for this solidarity not to take place on a mass scale. It's hugely important. It means a great deal. And eventually, of course, the Islamic Republic of Iran will be overthrown. But I guess what will be important is how much we all feel that we played a role in making that happen and making a positive change happen for people in Iran and in the region.
You're doing great, Maryam. I think it brings us to end of our program for this week. Until next week, which will discuss labor movement in Iran and recent strikes, which is quite important and significant, is a major development. Until next week, goodbye from both of us. Have a good week. Bye-bye.